All right, let's have this conversation. This is this type of stuff I get to do when I'm working on a sermon, and then I just get to a place where, like, all right, I need to take a break from the sermon. All right. One of the beautiful things about having kids, if that's the Lord's will for you and you have children, is, and if you're of the Christian tradition like I am, you have to figure out, how do I explain things to my kids so that it makes sense? And try to explain them. If you're a believer, right, a believer in Jesus, you have sort of a challenge, right? Because you have to teach your kids, or just anyone, we're trying to explain that things that we like to do are actually bad for us. Right? Things that we like to do. And some of those things aren't bad because it's like a drug or something like that, right? But they're things, so it can be hard to think about this and figure it out. And sin is one of those particular categories. Now, last kind of live stream I did, it was called, basically I was answering the question, why do we confess sin to God? That was my last video. Many of you have been watching it and been getting to me and been encouraged by it. Thank you. Today's video, I want to ask a different question. Here's a different question I want to ask. Do we have the right view of sin? Like, do we have the right view of what sin is? Now, most people, even if they're not Christians, will tell you that sin is disobeying God, right? And in the grand scheme of what sin is, missing the mark, thoughts, actions, words. If you disobey God, that's what sin is. Good answer. But I think the Bible gives us another way to look at sin that I think better explains why we are so trapped into doing it. And why people, like, you ever try to preach the gospel to someone, share the gospel? And one of the things that they struggle with, like, one of the things most people struggle with when it comes to, like, being a Christian is, man, I don't want to give up the stuff I'm doing, though, right? Like, I don't want to, like, if they're honest enough to be like, man, I don't want to stop having sex. Like, I don't want to not get high. I don't want to go to church. Like, go to church instead of going to the club. Like, that just doesn't make sense to most people. Or just whatever they're doing, whatever it is. It does not make sense to most people when they hear the gospel to give up some of the things that they're doing to go to church and pray and stuff like that, right? So what's the disconnect? There's a real disconnect there that the Bible, I think, explains, and it's really interesting because the Bible does not use this phrase that often. And I'm kind of surprised, not that God did something wrong, but I think this phrase captures a view of sin that we need to rethink. All right, so let's look at what this passage says. This is Hebrews chapter 11, and here's what God is saying through the writer of Hebrews. Beginning in verse 24, listen to this. Listen to how the Bible describes sin. Now, you might be like, duh, but I guarantee you, many of us, and I don't really hear sin talked about in this way, even though this phrase is in the Bible. So here it says, Hebrews 11:24, right? By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, right? Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, all right? This phrase right here is gold. This is the phrase. Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I don't know what Bible translation you use, but you will not find this phrase describing sin in more than one or two places in the Bible. But I think this phrase is the epitome of what sin is and what Christianity is really about. So here it says, Moses chose to be mistreated than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Brothers and sisters, if you're watching this right now, you're watching it later, I don't care. Truth is truth, whether it's live or recorded. Here's the reality. sin is fun. Sin is pleasurable. And most of us, as Christians, sin because there is, to some degree, a benefit for us. And this is the challenge. This is the rub. This is what unbelievers, when confronted with the gospel, are wrestling with. They're not, do you know, no one wrestles with, do they want to go to hell or not? There's no one that wants to go to hell. If they believe that there's a literal hell, there's no one who realistically wants to go to hell. So what is it that unbelievers struggle with when they hear the gospel? It's not, hey, you can escape hell. Shoot, I'll do that any day. What I got? Sign me up. But there are pleasures of sin that you have to give up. And that is the rub. People don't want to give up the pleasure of sin. And as Christians, I think we oftentimes forget that sin is pleasurable. It's actually fun. Some of my funnest memories, greatest joys before being a Christian, the devil's trying to stop it by freezing me out. I rebuke you, demon who's in the camera. This camera, I just need a new camera for real. Some of my most fondest memories are sinful, and they were funny. And I had to, over time, learn to see those things as not fun and pleasurable, but it took time. And this is a part of sin that I think all believers need to rethink. Now, if you think this way already, cool. I think many of us do not. That sin is pleasurable, and this is why we do it. We benefit from sin and this is why unbelievers are counting the cost of having to give that up. We don't want to give it up. Let me prove to you that this perspective, I think, is fundamental to even Jesus's gospel proclamation. Now, the word pleasure is not there, but listen to what Jesus says in Mark 8. And this is in different parts of the gospel. Listen to what Jesus says right here. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. All right. This is a thing that I feel like is woefully missing in the modern evangelical gospel presentation. It's these two words: deny himself. Deny yourself what? What are you denying yourself? Think about this. Jesus is mostly preaching to a bunch of poor people. The rich young ruler was an anomaly in Jesus' day. Most of the people that Jesus was speaking to on a consistent basis didn't really have anything. They weren't rich. They weren't the rich young ruler. They didn't have all this food to eat in excess. He said, deny himself. To follow Jesus, to be a Christian, we all have to deny ourselves. What are we denying ourselves? What are we denying ourselves? I don't even have that much. I got a little as it is. What am I denying myself? The fleeting pleasures of sin. Let's go a step further. Listen to what 1 Peter says, right? This is 1 Peter trying to encourage believers, right? Listen to what he says here. 1 Peter 5. Listen to this. Resist him, talking about Satan. Firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. All right. So in verse 8, he says, look, the devil rolls around like a prowling lion seeking for someone to devour. Verse 9, resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same. What kinds of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world? What kind of sufferings? Listen, let's just be clear. We always think of suffering as like sort of a degree of like persecution for your faith. Let me just say this, and I'm not the Lord, and that's obvious, right? I'd be a chubby black Jesus, right? Look, here's the reality. Many of us are not going to be killed because we believe in Jesus, right? Our suffering is not going to be an external torture because we believe in Jesus. And the majority of people's sufferings around the world are not going to be You believe in Jesus, so people are going to kill you. So what suffering is being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world? What is the one suffering that every single Christian has to go through, whether you're persecuted for your faith by other people or not? What's the one suffering we all have to go through? We gotta resist the devil. And what does the devil offer? Pleasure in sin. Let me be clear. Sex in marriage does not feel more pleasurable than sex when you're sinning. What's different is I don't feel guilty after I do it in that sense. But it's not like, oh, when you get married, it's phenomenal. But when you're in, it doesn't work like that. Pleasure, it feels good no matter what. It feels good. Let's just be clear. It feels good to talk behind someone's back when we're angry at them. It feels good. We get a pleasure from it. It feels good to yell at someone and tell them what you really feel, especially if they hurt you. It feels good. It feels good when you're afraid of the consequences, and so you lie and you get out of it. Now, when I say it feels good, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't mean that if you're a genuine Christian, you don't feel conviction, right? That's not what I mean. But there is a particular pleasure that comes from giving in to sin. You know, me and my colleague were talking about this yesterday. I don't know. I'm going to study this. I don't know what all the brain receptivity is as it relates to endorphins and how it works. But I was like, you know what's interesting? It's, we were talking about this dynamic between people who are attractive, but deemed as more attractive by more people than other people. And we were talking about, you know what? Isn't it wild that if a woman were to walk by, we were having lunch, if a woman were to walk by that we were attracted to, the draw for me would be to look at her. I'm not going to say a word to her. I'm not going to do anything, but there's something pleasurable about looking at her because she's attractive. And if you're a woman, a guy, whatever, looking at someone there's a brief moment of pleasure I get from looking at this woman's body and her face, even though I'm not going to say anything to her, nothing's going to come out of it. That look, that lust, that's pleasure, right? Just even the look of it, seeing it. There's something about sin and pleasure that is the real reason why, even as genuine believers, it's difficult for us to go through it. This is why Jesus says you got to deny yourself, because every Christian, the majority of the suffering that you and I will experience as a Christian is going to be resisting the temptation to give in to sin. I mean, boy, don't you feel like when someone says something that offends you or offends someone you care about, man, in a moment you want to tell them who they are, right? That's how it works. There are, the way we need to rethink sin is like sin is actually pleasurable, it's fun, and I benefit from it. But what I learned by believing in Jesus and what the gospel is really asking me to do is to deny myself the fleeting pleasure of sin. Remember what he said in Hebrews 11:25, right? Moses chose to be mistreated rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. The Bible rarely uses that terminology, but it's 100% a way I think we need to think about it. And when I'm talking to my children, especially my oldest son, he's ninth grade. He goes to public school. Most of his best friends are unbelievers. They all want to be in relationships. You know, we have a good relationship, so he's bringing me into it, talking to me about what he's thinking. Of course he wants to be in a relationship. Of course he wants to kiss a girl. Of course. Now, if I go at it, son, that's evil and that's sinful and it doesn't glorify God. All of that would be true. But let me tell you where I think we've missed and why this phrase, the fleeting pleasure of sin, here's what that phrase is doing. And here's something that I think many Christians, we miss this. Pastors especially. We're all, sin is evil and sin is this and it doesn't glorify God and you go to, and all of that's true. But that's true ontologically, right? That's God's perspective. We have to consider the human element. The human element of sin is its pleasure. So if I teach my son sin is evil, which I have, you goes against the Lord, you're gonna, and then all of a sudden, let's just say he decides to go against the grain. His buddies are getting high and he just gets pressured in and he says, all right, I'm gonna do it too. And he gets high and he's having a blast. right? He's having a good time. He's laughing. He's giggling. He can't stop. He only is afraid when, like, okay, I got to go home. My dad might figure it. He might know I'm high, right? That's when he'll be afraid. But in that moment, the pleasure of that sin, and the whole time he thought, oh, I thought this was supposed to be evil and a bad thing. This was the best day of my life. This is what we, as believers, especially as pastors, man, we've just done, oh man, we mean well. Please understand, we mean well, pastors. I'm one of them. We mean well. But we take out the human element. You see, sin is pleasurable. That's why people do it. It's not just straight up and down rebellion. Yeah, it is, ontologically speaking, from God's perspective. But he also understands it's pleasurable. It's fun. Of course my son wants to kiss this girl. He wants her to touch him. Of course. If I just teach him, no, son, that's sinful, you got to wait till you get married, I miss the human element. I think many of us, we forget the human element, and we're just not honest with ourselves. We sin sometimes willfully because we enjoy it. We don't enjoy it afterwards. We know that it's wrong, but there's a pleasure that comes with giving into sin. It's fleeting, as this passage says, it's fleeting, but it's real. And we need to rethink how we think about sin, because a lot of us, myself included, man, there are patterns that I have that I'm kind of trapped in, and I'm not trapped like, I can't stop. I'm trapped in, I get pleasure from this. And I really got to learn to say, Lord, your pleasure, the pleasure that comes by faith, not the one I'm going to receive in exchange for this one, right? I'm going to deny this sinful pleasure in faith for one that will last for eternity. So this one's fleeting, eternity's forever. This is what I think a lot of us just don't get. And so as counselors, as pastors, we're talking to people, we're challenging people, and we're forgetting the human element. Hey, bitterness feels good, in all honesty. It's rare. It's only by the conviction of the Spirit that someone who's really bitter see it and feel bad. But when you're bitter at someone, they've hurt you, and you just can't think, it feels good to think less of them. When you're self-righteous, it feels good to think you're better than other people. You gain an identity and confidence from that. Sin is pleasurable. We benefit from it. All right, 2 other quick verses, and then I'm going to let y'all go. I know y'all getting tired of, it's not pleasurable to get this toothache, right? But it's the reality. This is the Bible. Sin is pleasurable. We need to think about it this way, because then we can relate to people and be like, you know what? Man, I get it. Like when I'm counseling people, I don't be self-righteous. Like, man, how could they do that? I know how they could do that, because it felt good to do it. I know how they could do it. Look at the enemy. Look at him trying to block out the screen because he can't handle the tooth. Not today, Satan, and not today, dentist. This is the reality, right? The fleeting pleasures of sin. This is the draw. This is why we sin. It's not just ontologically, theologically, we're totally depraved, and so we enjoy sin. It's pleasurable, right? Listen to this. 2 Thessalonians, right? Here's what Paul is saying. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may all be condemned. Listen to this. Who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Bang! There it is. You had pleasure in unrighteousness, right? Pleasure. Unrighteousness is pleasurable. We benefit from it. There's no one who's married and commits adultery because it's the worst thing ever. There's no one who gets drunk because it's the worst thing ever. Now, when you have a hangover and you're sitting over the toilet, then you're like, oh God, please, I promise not to do this. In that moment, but when you're getting pounded, it feels fantastic. It feels fantastic. When you're getting high, it feels fantastic until you're addicted, and now you've ruined all the relationships in your life, and now you can't stop. You feel like you can't because it's pleasurable. Sin is pleasurable. Listen to this. 2 Timothy, same dude. Paul wrote this, right? Listen to this. He's giving a list of sins in the last days. This is how people are going to act. Here's what he says right here. He says this: treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. I tell you what, as a pastor, me and my colleagues say this all the time. We get terrified sometimes because we all struggle with sin. But there are some sins that like pastors who like just doing crazy stuff, like having sex with other people's wives, like, and you think like, how could he? You know what? That's just a self-righteous statement. Whenever you quit, it's because it's pleasurable. And all of us have different proclivities to pleasure that we'll give into, right? The battle for Christians, while all of us suffer, as 1 Peter 5 says, all the suffering around the world is we're all fighting, giving in to the pleasure in unrighteousness. It feels good. And I don't think we think about that enough as believers. I think we have the ontological view. Sin is terrible. It's evil. It's Christ died on the cross. All of that's true. And my kids know that too. But the human element, so Jesus, fully God, fully man, right? The human element, like don't think for a second when Jesus was being tempted by Satan and it said he hadn't eaten for 40 days and Satan said, turn these stones to bread. Don't think for a second that Jesus just answered back like it was nothing. Don't think for a second that Jesus probably wasn't thinking about the bread his mom would make. You know, the butter that went on it nice. It was leavened, so it rose up nice, smelled good. He always knew, would run up by his mom and grab her leg and be like, Mom, when is the bread done? Like that was a real temptation for him. There's pleasure in that. When Satan said, I'll give you all these kingdoms, that's what Jesus came for. To get all these kingdoms and give them to the Father. That's what his will is, to do the will of the Father. That pleases the Father. I please the Father. That phrase Jesus uses all the time. He wants to please the Father. Please, a derivative of pleasure. I want to give the Father pleasure. That's when we use the phrase, I want to honor the Lord. We want to give the Lord pleasure. When it says we bless God, we want to give God pleasure in who we are. This is the real battle, for this is the way. Mandalorian. This is it. This is what I think we need to, and maybe you don't need to think that. You could think the way you think about it, and I could be wrong to you, that's fine. This is where I'm headed. And this is the way I'm teaching people who I know, because when I'm counseling people and they're stuck in sin and they're struggling, for most part, it's like, well, hey, let me ask you a question. Here's a question I'll ask people. So think of the issue. Think of the last time you gave in to this particular issue. Like, how did you benefit from it? Like, what did you feel like the benefit was in doing this? Now, there are patterns and habits. Don't get me wrong. When I say it's pleasurable, I don't mean that like we only think of it in pleasurable terms. A lot of times we just react. There's a habitual element to some of our sinfulness, right? There's a habitual element. But part of what made it habitual was sin is not like a tractor beam, right? It's not like I have to give in. No matter what, I have to. No. We give in, and it's not just because we're weak. It's just because we think the pleasure that we get from this, it just feels more tangible than the pleasure I'll get from this. I'll close with this story. This is when it started to really open my eyes. Some years ago, as a pastor, there was a woman in my church who was in a sexual relationship with a guy. I met with her quite a few times and to appeal to her to give up the relationship and honor the Lord. And I'll never forget. And she just said, and she was being honest, but she said, why would I give up? This was after a few meetings. It wasn't like right away. She said, why would I give up like the love I get from him for the love that I get from God, which I feel like I've never really experienced? And you know what? That was a tragic statement, but it was real to her. There's pleasure that I get from this guy that I've never experienced from God. Why would I give that up? Brothers and sisters, your battle with sin is a battle for pleasure. And it's going to be in faith. We're saying, Lord, I'm going to deny myself. I'm going to suffer like Moses, giving in. Let's put this back. I'm going to suffer like Moses. I'd rather be mistreated, and not by externally, but by my own desires, right? I'd rather be mistreated and then to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. This is the battle. So when Paul says in Romans 8:18, I consider that our present suffering are not worth being compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. When Hebrews 11:6 says, but if one must have faith, he must believe God, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him, right? That reward is connected to pleasure. God gives us pleasure. He rewards us for diligently seeking him. That's the battle. brothers and sisters. That's the battle. That's the battle. You know, my biggest challenge with like getting in shape, losing weight, being disciplined in that way is because food is just pleasurable, man. It's pleasurable. Just even the taste. I'm not even, you know, it's funny. I was telling my friend, man, I'm not even a glutton. I don't even overeat. I don't overeat at all. I could eat one meal and be good, but I might want to taste. I might want to just sip something or just taste something sweet or whatever it is because of the pleasure of it. Like we're always going to be drawn to pleasure, right? We're always going to be drawn to that. Last one, James 1:14, when it says each one is lured and enticed by his own desire. What is that? There's pleasure. You're lured and enticed by the pleasure that will come from giving into this sin. And so when we resist, because we believe in Jesus, what we're saying is the pleasure of you, Lord, that sometimes is not tangible. Let's be honest. That pleasure that I'm waiting for is in faith. The pleasure that I'm denying is in sight. And that is the battle of the Christian life. This is what I'm teaching my kids. Of course you want to do this, son, because it feels good. Sin is fun, but the wages of sin is death. And the first three letters of funeral spell fun. Take that with you. What do I know, though? What do I know? When I have found pleasure in this tooth, I got a root canal on Monday. Pray for me, because that's definitely not pleasurable. All right, y'all. I got to get back to the Sherman. Always a pleasure. Thank you for your kindness. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, please. Y'all should have done it a long time ago. I'm getting tired of y'all. It's not pleasurable when you don't hit the like and subscribe button, all right? We got to do it for the algorithm. We're trying to grow. I'm trying to lose weight, but I'm trying to grow the channel. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying. All right, y'all. Appreciate you, man. Grace and peace. See you when we see you.